The King Has Entered the Room, Mastering Presence and Power, by David Russo. A room does not change because someone speaks louder. It changes because someone enters who no longer needs to. Most people misunderstand power. They think it is volume, confidence, status, performance. But real power is quieter than all of that. It is the ability to alter how others experience themselves without saying a word. And once you see it clearly, you can't unsee it, because you will start noticing something unsettling. Some people walk into a room, and nothing changes. Others walk in, and everything recalibrates. The difference is not what they do, it is what they carry. Before any of this had language, it had a name. My name is David, and growing up, that name was never neutral. It carried an association, whether I asked for it or not. King David, not as a person I was meant to imitate, but as an idea I kept noticing. I didn't understand that at the time, but I noticed something. Some people spoke and held attention. Others didn't need to, and over time, that question stayed with me. What is it, exactly, that someone carries, that changes a room before they even speak? The story I told, The King Has Entered the Room, was my way of showing that without explaining it. This is where we explain it. Introduction. A few days ago, I told a story. The King Has Entered the Room, a cinematic audiobook story. This is what it really meant. That story was never about a man. It was about a mechanism, a pattern that shows up in real life, in meetings, relationships, interviews, social spaces, anywhere humans unconsciously negotiate status. What people call presence is often misunderstood as charisma, dominance, or extroversion. But true presence is not expressive. It is structural. It changes how a space organizes itself around you. We tend to think influence is something you do to a room, but in reality, most of it is something a room does to itself in response to what it detects in you. People adjust their tone, their pacing, their confidence, their silence, not because you instructed them to, but because your internal state makes certain behaviors feel appropriate and others feel unnecessary. That is the part most people miss. They focus on performance, how to speak better, how to stand differently, how to appear more confident. But performance is always downstream of something deeper. The real signal is not in what you project outward, it is in what you are still negotiating inwardly while you project it. Because people do not respond to words alone. They respond to coherence. When your attention is fragmented, split between how you are being perceived, how you should respond, and whether you are doing enough, you leak instability. Not in an obvious way, but in microsignals. Timing, hesitation, over-explanation, unnecessary adjustment, and other people register that instability instantly, even if they cannot articulate it. But when internal negotiation quiets down, something else becomes visible. Not louder behavior, cleaner behavior, less compensatory behavior. This is where the misunderstanding begins. Many assume that strong presence means intensity, force, or social dominance. But intensity still requires effort. Force still requires direction. Both imply resistance, and resistance implies a system still trying to control outcomes. True presence is different. It does not try to control the room. It removes the need for control in the first place. This book is not about becoming intimidating. It is not about manipulation. It is not about learning how to dominate social environments or extract compliance from others. Those are all variations of the same misunderstanding. That power is something you apply outwardly. Instead, this is about something quieter and far more difficult to fake. It is about removing internal noise so completely that other people can no longer use you as a projection surface for their assumptions. Most social dynamics rely on projection. People do not see you as you are. They see you as a reflection, shaped by their expectations, insecurities, and prior experiences. In most cases, you unconsciously collaborate with that projection by adjusting yourself to stabilize how you are being perceived. But when that internal adjustment stops, projection loses its anchor. There is nothing to distort, nothing to negotiate with, nothing to inflate or reduce. And in that moment, something subtle happens in the room. People begin to recalibrate, not because you demanded it, but because the system no longer knows how to position itself around ambiguity. The familiar cues that usually guide social behavior are no longer being reinforced. What remains is not dominance. It is clarity, and clarity has a very specific effect on human perception. It simplifies it. It reduces unnecessary interpretation. It removes excess story making. It makes behavior easier to read because there is less distortion in the signal. That is the real meaning behind "the king has entered the room," not elevation of one person above others. But the moment a system encounters something internally undivided and reorganizes itself around it, this book is not asking you to become someone else. It is asking you to notice what in you is constantly being adjusted for approval, acceptance, or control, and what happens when that adjustment is no longer running in the background, because when you are no longer performing identity, other people stop performing theirs around you, and what remains is not dominance, not performance, not noise. What remains is clarity and the strange stillness that comes when nothing in you is trying to be more than what it already is. Chapter 1. Presence is not performance. Most people begin with the wrong assumption that presence is something you build outwardly. They treat it like a skill set, a collection of adjustments, a controlled upgrade to how they speak, stand, gesture, and respond. They study tone. They rehearse confidence. They try to eliminate hesitation from their voice and replace uncertainty with certainty signals. But all of this sits on a flawed foundation, because presence is not what you add to behavior. It is what remains when behavior is no longer being used to manage perception. Performance is reactive by nature. It is built on awareness of being seen, evaluated, or interpreted. Even when it looks natural, it carries an underlying negotiation. How am I coming across? Is this working? Do I need to adjust? That negotiation is subtle, but constant, and more importantly, it is detectable, not consciously by others but structurally by the environment you are in. A person in performance mode is never fully in the moment. Part of their attention is always split, even if only slightly, between action and observation of action. That split creates friction, not visible tension in every case, but informational noise, a lack of clean signal, and rooms respond to clean signals. This is why two people can say the same sentence and produce completely different effects. One sentence comes from alignment, the other comes from self-monitoring. One arrives complete, the other arrives edited in real time. People often misinterpret this difference as charisma or confidence, but charisma is not the cause. It is the byproduct of reduced internal contradiction. Confidence, when performed, is still a strategy. Confidence, when real, is simply the absence of internal debate about permission. Presence begins where performance ends, not when you become more expressive but when you become less divided. There is a quiet shift that happens when someone stops trying to manage how they are being perceived. At first, nothing external changes. The voice may sound the same, the posture may look the same, the words may still be ordinary, but something underneath them is no longer interfering. That absence is what people feel, not intensity, not effort, not dominance, absence of self-interruption. This is why presence cannot be convincingly faked for long. You can mimic behaviors associated with confidence, but you cannot easily mimic internal coherence. The moment attention turns inward, am I doing this right? Am I being effective? The signal fractures again, and people pick up on the fracture faster than they pick up on the performance. In meetings, interviews, conversations, and even silent exchanges, what gets registered is not the content alone, but the stability behind it. A stable signal does not rush to justify itself. It does not overcorrect. It does not attempt to close every interpretive gap immediately. Performance does, because performance is afraid of being misread. Presence is not. This is where the misunderstanding deepens. Many people believe that if they remove hesitation, they will gain authority, so they suppress uncertainty rather than resolving it. They tighten their behavior. They reduce natural variability. They try to become more polished. But polish is still a form of management, and management is still effort. Presence is not the absence of emotion or thought. It is the absence of conflict with what is already occurring internally. You can feel uncertainty and still be present. You can feel pressure and still be grounded. The difference is whether those states are being resisted or simply witnessed. When there is no resistance, there is no performance, and when there is no performance, there is nothing left to maintain. This is why truly present people often appear unaffected by the room, even though they are fully aware of it. They are not suppressing response. They are not adding unnecessary response on top of what already exists. That distinction is subtle, but it changes everything, because rooms do not respond to effort. They respond to stability, and stability does not announce itself. It reveals itself by not needing to be anything other than what it already is. Presence begins there, not in becoming more convincing, but in becoming less divided between who you are and who you are trying to be while being seen. Chapter 2. The nervous system of a room. Every room has a nervous system, not a literal one but a collective one. It is formed by the combined attention, emotional state, and unconscious signaling of everyone inside it. And like any nervous system, it constantly regulates itself. It seeks equilibrium. It reacts to change. It stabilizes around whatever feels most consistent. Most people walk into a room thinking they are entering a static environment. They are not. They are entering a living system that is constantly recalibrating. At any given moment, a room is processing dozens of microsignals at once. Tone shifts, posture changes, eye contact, pacing of speech, hesitation, certainty, discomfort, overcompensation. None of these are consciously analyzed. They are absorbed and integrated instantly into a shared, unspoken emotional baseline. That baseline determines everything that follows. How fast people speak, how loud they feel comfortable being, how long silence can last before it becomes uncomfortable, what kinds of behavior feel natural in that space, and most importantly, how individuals adjust themselves to remain synchronized with the group. This is why rooms are rarely neutral. They are always leaning towards something calm. Tension, urgency, uncertainty, confidence, fragmentation. And that leaning is not dictated by any single person. It is emergent. It arises from the sum of all internal states interacting in real time. However, within every system, certain inputs carry disproportionate weight, not because they are louder, but because they are more stable. A room does not respond most strongly to intensity. It responds most strongly to consistency. When a signal is internally coherent, when behavior, tone, timing, and attention are not in conflict, it becomes easier for the entire system to organize around it. This is what people mislabel as presence. They assume it is influence exerted outward, but it is actually a form of environmental stabilization. When someone enters a room with internal fragmentation, the system registers instability. Others begin to unconsciously compensate. They may speak more quickly to fill perceived gaps, or become more performative to anchor their own position. The room subtly accelerates, trying to resolve ambiguity. But when someone enters with internal coherence, something different happens. The system slows, not because it is told to, but because it no longer needs to compensate. There is less interpretive work required, less emotional correction needed, less social guessing happening in the background, and as a result, attention begins to settle. This is the nervous system of a room at work. Constant adjustment toward whatever signal feels most reliable. It is important to understand that this process is not psychological in the individual sense. It is relational. No single person controls it. Instead, each person contributes to it. Like nodes in a shared feedback loop. One person speaks with uncertainty, gives others tighten their behavior. Another speaks with overconfidence, gives others begin to evaluate more critically. Someone remains grounded and unreactive, gives the system stabilizes around that baseline. None of this is deliberate. It is automatic, which is why it is so powerful and so often unnoticed. Most social environments feel unpredictable, not because they are chaotic, but because they are filled with competing signals. Different people broadcasting different levels of certainty, insecurity, urgency, or detachment. The nervous system of the room becomes fragmented, constantly trying to reconcile conflicting inputs. In such environments, people tend to overcompensate. They speak more than necessary. They emphasize points that do not require emphasis. They try to establish themselves in the system, as if stability must be earned through volume or repetition. But stability is not created through effort. It is created through consistency. And consistency is not about controlling others. It is about removing internal contradiction in yourself. When your internal state is stable, your external behavior becomes predictable in the best sense. not rigid, not rehearsed, but aligned. And the more aligned your signals are, the less corrective work the room has to do. That is when something subtle begins to shift. The system stops accelerating around uncertainty. It stops inflating noise to fill gaps. It begins to organize itself around a quieter reference point, not because that person is demanding attention, but because the system recognizes less distortion in that signal than in others. This is the hidden logic behind what people call commanding presence. It is not command, it is reduced interference. And when interference drops, the nervous system of the room naturally relaxes, because it no longer has to work as hard to understand what is happening. Chapter 3. Why Noise Loses to Stillness. Noise feels powerful. It fills space. It demands attention. It creates the impression that something important is happening simply because something is happening at all. But noise is not power. Noise is uncertainty in motion. Most people misunderstand loudness as dominance because, in early social experience, volume often correlates with controlled children interrupting, groups competing for attention, environments where speaking up is required just to exist within the conversation. Over time, the mind begins to associate more signal with more importance. But mature social systems operate differently. They do not reward the most noise. They stabilize around the most reliable signal. Stillness, in this context, is not the absence of expression. It is the absence of unnecessary correction. It is what remains when a person is not internally adjusting themselves in real time to secure approval, prevent misinterpretation, or maintain perceived status. Noise, by contrast, is adjustment made visible. It is effort trying to disguise itself as certainty, and effort always leaks information. When someone is speaking from noise, there is often a subtle sense of acceleration beneath the surface. Words arrive slightly too quickly, as if trying to outrun doubt. Pacing becomes uneven. Emphasis becomes exaggerated. Ideas are reinforced more than necessary. The message is not just being delivered, it is being defended. Stillness does not defend. It simply presents. This is why stillness often feels heavier in a room than sound. Not because it dominates acoustically, but because it removes the usual cues others rely on to calibrate their own behavior. Without constant verbal and emotional signaling, people begin to sense themselves more clearly, and in that clarity, unnecessary behavior becomes visible. Noise depends on reaction. Stillness does not, and anything dependent on reaction loses authority. The moment the audience stops reacting in the expected way, this is where the reversal happens. In noisy environments, attention is fragmented. People are pulled in multiple directions, responding to whoever is producing the most immediate stimulus. But fragmentation is unstable. It requires constant reinforcement. Without it, the system begins to search for a reference point that does not fluctuate. Stillness provides that reference point, not because it is empty, but because it is not competing. There is a difference between silence as absence and stillness as presence. Absence feels like something missing. Stillness feels like something settled. One creates tension, the other resolves it. When a person operates from stillness, they are no longer adding themselves to the room as another competing signal. They are removing distortion from their own output. They are not trying to outmatch noise. They are not escalating in response to escalation. They are not performing stability. They are simply not adding instability. And in a system full of competing signals, the absence of added distortion becomes noticeable. Not immediately, but inevitably, because human perception is constantly filtering for what is easiest to interpret. Noise requires interpretation. It forces the mind to sort, prioritize, and evaluate. Stillness reduces that burden. It creates less cognitive friction, and in doing so, it becomes easier to anchor attention around. This is why noise often burns itself out. It must constantly sustain itself. It must keep escalating, or at least maintaining intensity to preserve relevance. But escalation has limits. At some point, additional noise no longer increases clarity or authority, it only increases fatigue in the system receiving it. Stillness does not escalate, it remains consistent. And consistency outlasts intensity in every system that relies on perception. This is also why stillness can feel uncomfortable to those who are used to performing. In the presence of someone who is not participating in escalation, The usual strategies stop working. There is nothing to push against, nothing to outperform, nothing to interrupt that changes the underlying baseline. The room begins to recalibrate, not because it has been instructed to, but because it can no longer justify the same level of noise. And what replaces noise is not emptiness. It is awareness. Awareness of pacing, awareness of intention, awareness of unnecessary effort. Stillness does not silence a room. It reveals how much of the room was never necessary in the first place. Chapter 4. The Collapse of Over-Explanation. Over-explanation is rarely about clarity. It is about permission. People do not over-explain because the information is complex. They over-explain because they are uncertain whether their existence in the conversation has been fully accepted, so they add detail, then more detail, then clarification, layered on top of clarification, each sentence quietly asking the same question in different forms. Is this enough for me to be understood? But understanding is not the real goal. Acceptance is, and the moment acceptance is in doubt, language stops being a tool for communication and becomes a tool for stabilization. Over-explanation appears most often in environments where status is felt, even if unspoken: meetings, interviews, social comparisons, any setting where people feel they are being evaluated rather than simply heard. In those spaces, speech becomes slightly distorted, not incorrect, but inflated. Ideas that could be stated simply are expanded, points that could land cleanly are padded, statements that should end are extended, then extended again, not because more information is needed, but because silence after a statement feels risky. Silence becomes a gap that might be interpreted as weakness, incompleteness, or uncertainty, so people rush to fill it. They try to preempt misunderstanding by exhausting all possible interpretations in advance, but in doing so, they create a different problem. They introduce noise into what could have been clarity, and noise always requires processing. A simple statement arrives cleanly. It is received, held, and understood without resistance. An over-explained statement arrives with friction. It contains excess signals, competing qualifiers, and embedded doubt. The listener is no longer receiving a message, they are sorting through it. This is where authority begins to erode, not because the content is wrong, but because the structure signals instability. There is an important distinction here. Clarity is not the same as brevity. A message can be long and still be clear. What matters is whether each part of the message is necessary. Over-explanation is not measured in word count, it is measured in redundancy, in the subtle repetition of intent disguised as detail. When someone is grounded in what they are saying, they do not need to continuously reinforce it. The statement carries its own completion. It does not reach forward for validation. It does not circle back to justify itself. It simply ends when it is complete. Over-explanation struggles with endings, because endings imply closure, and closure implies that nothing further is required. For many people, that moment feels unsafe. If nothing further is required, then nothing further is protecting the statement from being questioned. So they keep speaking. They add a second layer of reasoning, then a third. They anticipate objections and answer them preemptively. They expand context to reduce perceived ambiguity. But what they are actually doing is revealing internal negotiation in real time. And internal negotiation is always visible, even when unspoken. A person who is not over-explaining does not appear to know more. They appear to require less defense of what they already know. Their words land with finality not because they are aggressive, but because they are settled. There is no visible effort to secure agreement. Agreement is not being pursued, it is not even being managed. This is where presence and over-explanation diverge completely. Presence does not require reinforcement. Over-explanation is reinforcement, and reinforcement is what you use when you do not trust the stability of your own signal. In conversations, this difference becomes immediately felt. A person who speaks with unnecessary elaboration, often unintentionally, shifts the burden onto the listener. The listener must now determine what is essential, what is secondary, and what is simply anxiety translated into language. This increases cognitive load. An increased cognitive load reduces perceived authority, not because the speaker lacks competence, but because their communication signals instability and prioritization. When someone stops over-explaining, something subtle happens. Their speech becomes lighter, but not less meaningful. Their sentences become more decisive, but not more aggressive. Their ideas become easier to hold, not because they are simpler, but because they are no longer entangled with justification, and in that reduction, something important emerges. Trust in the speaker's internal alignment, because people do not only listen to what is said, they listen to how much effort it takes for it to be said. Over-explanation is effort made audible, and once effort becomes visible, it begins to undermine the very thing it is trying to protect. The collapse of over-explanation is not the loss of detail. It is the removal of unnecessary defense. And what remains after that collapse is not silence. It is precision. Chapter 5. Attention follows certainty, not volume. Attention is not as democratic as people assume. It does not distribute itself evenly. It does not reward the loudest input in a fair, mechanical way. And it does not simply follow whoever speaks first or most forcefully. Attention is selective, and what it selects is not volume. It is certainty. Volume can interrupt attention, but it cannot hold it for long. It can break a pattern, but it cannot replace the need for stability. This is why loudness often produces a brief spike of focus followed by rapid disengagement. The system notices it, processes it, and then searches for something more coherent to orient around. Certainty, however, behaves differently. It does not compete for attention. It organizes it. When someone speaks with internal certainty, there is a reduction in interpretive effort for the listener. The message does not feel like it needs decoding, correction, or filtering. Even if the content is complex, the structure feels resolved. There is no visible struggle between thought and expression, and the human mind is always searching for the path of least resistance. When allocating attention, in any shared environment, attention is constantly being negotiated at an unconscious level. People are not only listening, they are calibrating. They are deciding, moment by moment, what deserves focus and what can be safely backgrounded. Most of this happens below awareness, but the criteria are consistent: stability, coherence, and predictability of signal. Volume disrupts, but does not stabilize. Certainty stabilizes, even without disruption. This is why some of the quietest people in a room can still hold disproportionate influence over the direction of attention, not because they are trying to lead, but because their presence requires less cognitive correction from others. The system does not have to adjust itself as frequently around them. Contrast this with volume-based presence. When someone relies on loudness, emphasis, or verbal intensity, they often unintentionally increase the processing burden on everyone else. The listener must distinguish between emotional intensity and informational content. They must filter signal from noise. They must determine whether emphasis reflects importance or insecurity. That additional work fragments attention, and fragmented attention is unstable attention. It shifts easily, it fatigues quickly, it resists anchoring. Certainty reduces that burden, not by simplifying ideas, but by removing hesitation from their delivery. A certain statement does not reach forward for approval. It does not test itself against the listener's reaction mid-expression. It does not attempt to adjust itself in real time to ensure acceptance. It arrives complete. That sense of completion is what holds attention, because attention is not just drawn to novelty, it is anchored by resolution. The mind is naturally attracted to unresolved patterns, but it does not stay with them unless they begin to resolve into something coherent. Without resolution, attention drifts. With too much instability, attention fragments entirely. This is where many misunderstand influence. They assume influence is about capturing attention initially, but capturing attention is the easiest part. The real difference lies in retention. What keeps attention from leaving? Once it has arrived, volume can capture, certainty retains, and retention is where perceived authority is formed. There is another subtle layer to this dynamic. People often confuse certainty with rigidity. But rigidity is not certainty, it is defended uncertainty. It is structure used to hide internal doubt. It feels forced because it is compensating for something unstable underneath. True certainty does not feel forced. It feels unnecessary to defend. This distinction is crucial in how attention behaves around individuals. When people sense that a signal is being defended, they unconsciously begin to test it. They probe for inconsistency. They look for cracks, not out of hostility, but out of a natural system-level desire to resolve ambiguity. But when a signal does not appear defensive, it does not trigger the same testing behavior. Instead, it is accepted provisionally and allowed to occupy space in awareness without resistance. That is where attention settles, not because it is controlled, but because it is not resisted by the system receiving it. In group settings, this effect compounds. One stable signal reduces the need for others to overcompensate. One coherent voice lowers the baseline tension in the room. And as the system stabilizes, attention begins to cluster around whatever is least effortful to follow, not the loudest input, the clearest one. This is why volume often loses long-term influence battles. It burns attention faster than it can stabilize it. It demands continuous reinforcement to maintain presence. Certainty does the opposite. It requires less and less effort to sustain its hold on attention, because it does not generate internal resistance. The more stable the signal, the less energy the system expends interpreting it, and the less energy required, the longer attention remains. Ultimately, attention is not a reward for intensity. It is a response to clarity under minimal friction, and clarity is not how much you say. It is how little of what you say feels uncertain while you are saying it. Chapter 6. The invisible pressure of self-awareness. Most people assume they are reacting to others in a room. In reality, they are reacting to themselves while others are present. The moment attention is shared, something subtle happens. Self-observation increases, not necessarily in an anxious or dramatic way, but as a quiet shift in awareness. Speech begins to include a second layer of monitoring. Thoughts are no longer just formed, they are also checked while forming. Even silence changes quality because it is no longer neutral. It becomes something that might be interpreted. This is the beginning of what changes social behavior more than anything else. Not other people, but the awareness of being perceived while acting. When this self-awareness is low, behavior flows directly from intent. Words are shaped by what is being expressed, not by how they might be received. There is less internal interruption, so communication tends to feel cleaner. Even if it is imperfect, people often describe this as naturalness, though nothing about it is constructed to appear natural. When self-awareness increases, another layer appears between intention and expression. That layer is not always visible from the outside, but it is structurally present in the behavior itself. Sentences become slightly more edited. Timing becomes more cautious. Ideas arrive with subtle qualifiers attached to them, as if they are being gently tested while being spoken. This is not a flaw in the person. It is a normal response to social exposure. The mind is attempting to reduce risk misunderstanding, rejection, misalignment. But in doing so, it introduces a new variable, interference. Interference is not noise in the obvious sense. It is not hesitation that can be easily pointed to. It is the accumulation of micro-adjustments happening in real time. A word softened here, a pause extended there, a clarification added before it is needed, an explanation slightly expanded to avoid ambiguity. Each adjustment is small, but together they form a different kind of signal, one that carries evidence of internal negotiation, and people register that negotiation, even if they cannot articulate it, not as judgment, but as interpretation load. The listener begins to do more work. They are no longer only receiving meaning, they are also filtering intention, separating emphasis from insecurity, distinguishing clarity from correction. Attention does not disappear in this process, but it becomes less stable. It moves more frequently, anchors less easily, and carries a subtle sense of effort. What is often misunderstood here is the direction of influence. It is not that others are becoming aware of you in a deliberate sense. It is that the signal you are producing contains varying degrees of internal coherence, and the mind naturally reacts to coherence by reducing or increasing its own effort. When coherence is high, interpretation becomes easier. The listener does not have to constantly resolve uncertainty in the message. When coherence is low, even slightly, the mind compensates automatically, trying to complete what feels unfinished. This is why certain people feel easier to listen to, even when they are not saying anything particularly remarkable. The ease is not in the content, it is in the absence of visible self-interruption. And this is where the invisible pressure emerges. In environments where evaluation is felt, people do not only manage what they say, they also manage what they think while saying it. This creates a loop. Expression is shaped by perception, and perception is shaped by anticipated interpretation. The more this loop intensifies, the more behavior becomes layered with correction. At a certain point, the person is no longer fully speaking from a single internal source. They are speaking from a conversation between intent and imagined reception. That is what others sense as effort. Even when nothing is being forced, effort is not always volume. It is often friction. And friction is what appears when behavior is no longer flowing directly from intention, but is being continuously adjusted in relation to itself. When this layer quiets even slightly, something noticeable changes. Speech becomes more direct, but not harsher. Pauses feel more intentional, but not calculated. There is less sense that something is being managed underneath what is being said. This is the point where presence begins to be felt, though it is not something that is added. It is simply the reduction of internal commentary that was previously shaping output in real time. What remains is not perfection. It is continuity between thought and expression. And in social environments, continuity is interpreted as stability not because it is performing stability, but because it is no longer visibly splitting itself while appearing. Chapter 7. Why most people feel smaller around certain individuals. It is easy to misunderstand this experience. People assume it is about hierarchy, dominance, or some unspoken contest for status. They assume one person is higher, and therefore others feel lower. But what is actually happening is more subtle and less dramatic. It is not inferiority, it is contrast. When two people enter the same space, they do not just observe each other's behavior. They also register differences in internal consistency, not in a moral sense, and not in a consciously analytical way, but as a kind of perceptual comparison. The mind is constantly mapping stability, effort, hesitation, and coherence in real time, and contrast becomes visible when those patterns are far apart. A person who is internally fragmented, meaning their attention is split between expression and self-correction, tends to produce behavior that carries small inconsistencies. These inconsistencies are normal and human, but they create a certain texture in communication. Slight over-adjustments, subtle delays, unnecessary additions, or changes in tone that suggest ongoing internal editing. Around that kind of signal, most people feel familiar. There is a shared level of effort in maintaining social flow. Everyone is, in their own way, managing how they are being perceived. But when someone enters a space without that visible layer of internal adjustment, the contrast becomes noticeable, not because they are doing less, but because they are not splitting their attention in the same way. Their behavior appears more continuous, not necessarily more confident in the performative sense, but less interrupted. There is less evidence of negotiation happening underneath what is being expressed. Thoughts seem to arrive and leave through speech without visible resistance, and the mind observing this does something important. It recalibrates its reference point. This recalibration is often misinterpreted as feeling smaller, but nothing about the person has actually changed in size, importance, or value. What changes is the relative comparison between two behavioral patterns. One pattern contains more internal friction, the other contains less, and in that contrast, the second appears more settled. This shift does not happen through judgment. It happens through processing efficiency. The brain prefers signals that require less correction. When it encounters a pattern that is easier to interpret, it naturally allocates attention toward it, not because it is superior, but because it is less costly to track. At the same time, the presence of a highly coherent signal can make others more aware of their own internal variability, not in a conscious, reflective way, but as a subtle increase in self-observation. They may become slightly more aware of their pacing, their phrasing, or the way their thoughts are forming into speech. This is where the feeling of exposure sometimes arises, not exposure in the sense of being judged, but exposure in the sense of being more clearly aware of one's own variability, in contrast to another's steadiness. And that awareness can be uncomfortable, not because anything is being revealed externally, but because internal noise becomes more noticeable against a quieter reference point. Importantly, this effect is not stable or universal. It depends heavily on context, relationship, and the observer's own baseline of self-awareness. In environments where people are relaxed and not engaged in self-monitoring, the contrast effect is much weaker. In high-stakes or evaluative environments, it becomes more pronounced. What matters most is not the presence of another person's strength, but the reduction of interpretive friction they introduce. When someone's behavior is easy to read because it is not constantly adjusting itself in response to imagined interpretation, others do not need to work as hard to stabilize their understanding of the interaction. And when less work is required, attention naturally gravitates toward that stability. This is the quiet mechanism behind what is often labeled as presence, not superiority, not intimidation, but a difference in how much internal correction is visible in the signal being produced, and in that difference, perception reorganizes not around status, but around ease. Chapter 8. The End of Social Noise. Most social behavior is not expression, it is maintenance. People maintain impressions, maintain belonging, maintain tone, maintain alignment with what they believe the moment requires. Very little of what happens in conversation is purely direct. Most of it is adjusted in real time to preserve a sense of stability within the self, within the interaction, and within the imagined perception of others. This maintenance is usually invisible to the people performing it. It feels natural because it has been practiced for so long that it no longer registers as effort. But from the outside, it creates a very specific kind of environment, one filled with subtle noise, not literal noise, but informational noise. Signals that are slightly over-clarified, slightly overshaped, slightly more careful than they need to be. Ideas that are not just expressed, but adjusted as they are expressed. Sentences that carry traces of correction inside them, as if they are being guided away from potential misreading before misreading even occurs. This is what gives many social spaces their underlying tension. Not conflict, not disagreement, but continuous micro-adjustment. When everyone is adjusting, nothing is fully stable, and when nothing is fully stable, attention becomes fragmented. People begin tracking not only what is being said, but what might be implied, what might be misinterpreted, what might need clarification next. Communication becomes layered with anticipation. This anticipatory layer is the core of social noise. It is not what is spoken, it is what is being managed underneath what is spoken. In most environments, this noise is accepted as normal because it serves a function. It reduces risk. It prevents misunderstanding. It keeps interactions smooth enough to continue. But smoothness is not the same as clarity. A smooth interaction can still be filled with internal correction. Even if nothing appears outwardly wrong, the interesting shift happens when this maintenance layer begins to weaken. When someone stops over-adjusting their speech in real time. When they stop adding unnecessary reinforcement to their own meaning, when they stop reacting internally to every potential interpretation of their words, something in the environment changes. Not immediately, but structurally. Other people no longer have to filter as much. They are not being given excess material to interpret. There are fewer corrective signals embedded in the communication. This reduces the background effort required to stay oriented in the interaction. And when effort decreases, perception becomes simpler. This simplicity is not emptiness. It is the absence of unnecessary processing. The message becomes easier to hold because it is not competing with its own corrections. There is less internal contradiction embedded in the signal. At first, this can feel unfamiliar. Social systems are used to redundancy, extra explanations, clarifications, softened edges, signals of alignment. When those redundancies are removed, the interaction can feel more direct than expected, sometimes even sharper, though nothing harsher has actually been introduced. What has changed is not tone, but density. There is less noise between intent and expression, and because of that, what remains becomes more visible. This is where many people misinterpret the shift. They assume something has been asserted more strongly, when in reality, less has been added to dilute it. The absence of constant adjustment creates the impression of firmness, even when the underlying state is neutral. Over time, this reduction in social noise affects the structure of the interaction itself. People begin to speak more directly in response, not because they are instructed to, but because the environment no longer supports or requires as much compensatory behavior. There is less need to preempt misunderstanding when the signal itself feels stable enough to hold its own shape. What emerges is not dominance and not silence, but a different kind of conversational economy, one where fewer signals are needed to achieve the same level of understanding. In such environments, attention behaves differently. It is no longer pulled toward constant adjustment or correction. It rests more easily on what is being said, because there is less competition between message and meta-message. This is the quiet endpoint of reduced social noise, not control over the room, but the removal of unnecessary layers that previously made the room feel more complex than it needed to be. And when those layers thin out, what remains is not emptiness, but clarity that no longer has to compete with itself. Chapter 9. Presence without ego is uncontestable. Ego enters a room with a job to do. It wants to be recognized, positioned, validated, measured. It arrives with an internal agenda that constantly scans the environment for confirmation. Where do I stand here? Am I being seen correctly? Do I need to adjust to maintain or improve my position? This is not vanity in the superficial sense. It is structural self-protection. Ego is what organizes behavior when identity feels like it must be maintained in real time. But maintenance always creates movement underneath the surface. When ego is active, communication is never just communication. It is layered with subtle attempts to influence perception. Emphasis placed here, restraint applied there, tone adjusted slightly to avoid being misread or underestimated. Even silence becomes strategic. Nothing is fully neutral because everything is partially in service of positioning. This is what makes ego-based presence inherently unstable. It depends on continuous calibration, and anything that requires constant calibration is, by definition, reactive to its environment. Presence without ego operates differently, not because it lacks awareness of others, but because it is not organizing itself around them. There is no internal effort to secure position before expression. No need to adjust mid-signal to preserve identity. No secondary layer of monitoring that evaluates whether what is being expressed is producing the correct impression. The result is not force, it is removal of interference, and this distinction is crucial. Many people confuse presence without ego with dominance, but dominance still belongs to the same structure. As ego, it is just ego expressed more directly. It still relies on positioning, comparison, and relative hierarchy. It still needs a reference point to define itself against. Presence without ego does not require that reference point. This is why it is difficult to contest, not because it overwhelms opposition, but because it is not participating in the same structure that allows opposition to form in the usual way. There is nothing being defended, so there is nothing to destabilize. There is no visible attempt to secure meaning, so there is no leverage point created by insecurity or overinvestment. In most social interactions, conflict, whether subtle or explicit, emerges from competing attempts to stabilize perception. Two or more people adjust themselves in relation to imagined or real interpretations, and in that adjustment, friction appears. Even agreement can carry friction if it is being shaped by the need to be seen in a certain way. When ego is absent or significantly reduced, that layer of adjustment thins out. Expression becomes less about managing perception and more about simply presenting what is already present internally. This does not guarantee agreement, but it reduces the conditions under which disagreement becomes reactive or charged. People often misinterpret this state as indifference, but it is not indifference. Indifference withdraws from engagement. Presence without ego remains engaged, but without the added layer of self-protection shaping every response. This creates a very specific perceptual effect in others. Without obvious signals of insecurity or strategic adjustment, there is less material for interpretation beyond the content itself. The mind no longer has to separate message from positioning or intent from correction. As a result, communication feels more direct, even when nothing about it is forceful. And when communication becomes easier to interpret, resistance has less to attach to. This is where the idea of uncontestability begins to make sense, not as dominance, but as reduced interpretive friction. Contest requires leverage points, tension, contradiction, overstatement, insecurity, or excess assertion. Ego unintentionally provides these points because it is constantly involved in self-stabilization. When ego is no longer organizing the signal, those leverage points diminish. What remains is less about winning or losing, and more about clarity. That does not invite correction, unless correction is genuinely necessary. This is also why presence without ego often feels strangely disarming. It does not push against others, so others find less internal justification to push back. The usual social reflex is evaluation, competition. Subtle opposition have fewer triggers to activate. What replaces them is not submission or agreement, but a reduction in unnecessary reaction. And in that reduction, something important becomes visible. The interaction is no longer shaped by two competing identities, trying to maintain themselves, but by one person expressing and another receiving without added distortion. This is not a perfect state. Ego does not disappear permanently in human behavior. It fluctuates, returns, and responds to context. But even brief moments where it is not organizing the interaction can dramatically change the tone of an exchange, because in those moments, nothing is being defended, and when nothing is being defended, there is very little left that needs to be contested. Chapter 10. Becoming the constant in the room. Every room is unstable at the start, not visibly but structurally. It is made of shifting attention, unspoken expectations, subtle insecurities, and constantly adjusting interpretations. People enter carrying different internal states, and those states begin interacting immediately. Even before words are exchanged, the system is already moving, testing, aligning, recalibrating. Most people participate in this instability without noticing it. They adapt to it in real time, adjusting tone, timing, and expression based on what seems appropriate in the moment. In doing so, they become part of the fluctuation. Their behavior changes as the room changes, and the room changes again in response. A loop forms, perception shaping expression, expression reshaping perception. This is what makes most social environments feel slightly unsettled beneath the surface. Even when everything appears fine on the outside, there is movement everywhere, but very little anchoring. To become the constant in the room is not to dominate this movement. It is to stop adding instability to it. A constant is not something that asserts itself loudly. It is something that remains consistent regardless of variation around it. It does not require the environment to settle before it expresses itself. It expresses without being reshaped by every subtle shift in the environment. This is not personality in the conventional sense. It is not about being calm, confident, or composed as a performance. Those qualities can still be reactive if they depend on maintaining an image. A constant is not maintaining anything. It is not adjusting itself in response to imagined interpretation. It is simply not participating in unnecessary fluctuation. When someone behaves this way, something subtle changes in how others orient themselves. People naturally look for reference points in uncertain environments. They seek signals that reduce ambiguity, even unconsciously. Most of the time, those reference points are temporary, because they are also participating in the same fluctuations as everyone else. But occasionally, a person does not fluctuate in the same way. Their behavior remains more continuous across changes in tone, pace, or attention. That continuity becomes noticeable, not because it is dramatic, but because it reduces the amount of correction others need to perform internally. There is less guessing, less recalibrating, less effort spent tracking subtle shifts in meaning or intention. The mind does not have to repeatedly adjust its interpretation of the signal, and when adjustment decreases, stability is perceived. This is what it means to function as a constant reference point. Not that others submit to you or orient around you by force, but that they unconsciously reduce the amount of interpretive work required when interacting with you. Over time, this changes the structure of the interaction itself. Instead of a dynamic where everyone is subtly reshaping themselves around everyone else, a quieter asymmetry appears. One signal remains more stable while others continue to move. And because humans are efficiency-seeking systems in perception, attention begins to rest more easily on what requires less correction. Importantly, This is not about being unaffected or detached. A constant is still responsive. It still engages, reacts, and participates. The difference is that its responses are not constantly rewritten in real time based on self-observation. They are not continuously filtered through concern about how each adjustment is being perceived. This reduces the lag between internal state and external expression, and that reduction in lag is what others experience as consistency. Consistency is often underestimated because it does not create spikes in attention. It does not overwhelm or dominate. Instead, it lowers cognitive friction. It makes interaction easier to track, and anything that makes tracking easier tends to become a natural anchor point for attention in group settings. In contrast, when someone is highly variable, when their tone, pacing, or emotional signal shifts frequently in response to internal monitoring, the environment becomes more effortful to interpret. People must continuously update their understanding of what that person is communicating, not just in content, but in underlying state. This creates subtle instability in the interaction. The constant does not remove this instability through control. It simply does not contribute to it. And because of that, the surrounding system begins to organize itself more efficiently around that steadier input. What emerges is not authority in the traditional sense, and not dominance in the social sense, but a kind of gravitational clarity. Not because anything is being pulled, but because fewer things are being added that disrupt orientation. This is the final shift described across all previous chapters. Not becoming louder, not becoming more deliberate, not becoming more forceful, but becoming less variable in how presence is expressed moment to moment. Because when variability decreases, interpretation becomes easier, and when interpretation becomes easier, the mind naturally returns to what is easiest to hold steady. That is what it means to become the constant in the room, not the center, not the authority, but the least distorted signal in a field of constant adjustment. Conclusion: what remains when you stop performing? If there is a single misunderstanding that runs through everything written here, it is the belief that presence is something you build. It is not. It is what remains when the layers of unnecessary performance stop interfering with what is already there. Most people live with a quiet, continuous adjustment running in the background. They monitor how they are coming across, anticipate interpretation, and refine expression in real time. This does not always look like anxiety. Often it appears as competence, social awareness, or simply being thoughtful. But underneath it is a constant act of internal editing, and that editing changes everything. It introduces delay between thought and speech. It adds correction into tone. It creates subtle hesitation where there does not need to be any. Over time, this becomes indistinguishable from personality itself. People no longer notice the adjustment, they only notice the result of it. Presence begins where that adjustment becomes unnecessary, not because awareness of others disappears, but because the need to continuously manage how one is being seen loses priority over simply expressing what is already clear internally. When that shift happens, something subtle changes in communication, not in content alone, but in structure. Messages become less entangled with self-correction. Speech carries less visible negotiation. Silence stops functioning as a gap that must be filled. What others experience in response is often described in different ways: clarity, confidence, calmness, groundedness, or being easy to listen to. But these are just labels for a simpler phenomenon: the reduction of interference in a signal. When interference drops, interpretation becomes easier, and when interpretation becomes easier, attention does not need to work as hard to stabilize itself around what is being expressed. It is not drawn by force, it settles by efficiency. This is where many people misread presence as something external or performative. They assume it comes from posture, tone, dominance, or learned communication techniques. Those elements can influence perception, but they are not the source. They are downstream effects of something more fundamental: the degree to which a person is divided against themselves while expressing anything at all. A divided signal is always slightly unstable. It carries traces of self-monitoring, even if subtle. A unified signal does not eliminate complexity, it simply stops fragmenting itself while expressing that complexity. and that lack of fragmentation is what others perceive as coherence. Coherence is not perfection. It does not mean there is no uncertainty, no emotion, no hesitation in life. It means those internal states are no longer constantly reshaping expression in real time. They are allowed to exist without becoming additional layers of correction. From the outside, this does not look dramatic. In fact, it often looks like less is happening. Fewer words, fewer adjustments, fewer attempts to manage outcome. But underneath that reduction is something more significant: the removal of unnecessary resistance between intention and expression. And when that resistance is no longer present, communication begins to carry a different weight, not because it is louder, but because it is no longer competing with itself. The idea of the room changing was never about control over others. It was about what becomes possible when internal fragmentation is reduced, enough that perception no longer has to constantly interpret instability. People respond less to what is being projected and more to what is not being distorted in the projection. In that sense, presence is not an achievement, it is a subtraction, a gradual removal of the need to perform identity in order to feel valid within interaction. What remains after that removal is not a role, not a persona, and not a perfected version of behavior. What remains is simply communication that is no longer split into layers of intent and correction at the same time. And in ordinary terms, that is all presence has ever been. Not becoming someone more, but becoming less divided while being what you already are.